So, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I was thinking that I have 90 minutes to 2 hours to talk about a subject I love, Bordeaux. And I've been doing this a long time. This is 33 years I've been immersed in this field of wine. And I was thinking, how can I sort of condense much of what I've learned and appreciated in these 33 years. Now, looking out there and seeing a lot of young people, think back 33 years ago. I'm so old and have done this for so long. That was when you didn't have a remote control to change the stations on your televisions. That was when you listened to music through Sony's Walkman. iPod hadn't been invented. There were no cell phones. There were no laptops. And Bordeaux was a completely different place when I first went there as a wine tasting professional in 1998. And what I think I'll get into it in more detail as we go through the tasting, I chose these 20 wines as sort of a magical 20. It could have been a magical 40 or it could have been a magical 50, given the qualitative revolution that has taken place in Bordeaux over the last 2 or 3 decades. But at some point we have to put a end, and so we can only taste 20, which is a lot of wines in a short period of time, and a lot of young wine. But when I look back the 33 years, I ask myself, why has Bordeaux stood out so strongly in the world of wine? We have seen, as wine consumers, as people in the wine trade, we have seen this proliferation of quality of wine throughout the world. From places that when I started, we never imagined there would be the high quality wines that now emerge from places from bucolic and backwater places of Spain, from southern Italy, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa, from Argentina, from Chile, more recently from Greece and from Portugal. And of course, I think in the future we're going to see high quality wines emerge from China. This has all taken place in a relatively short period of time of 30 years. When I look at Bordeaux 30 years ago, Bordeaux was somewhat of a depressing place. The city was relatively dirty. It has been completely reformed by a dynamic mayor by the name of Juppé. The wines that when I would go and taste, I would say only 50% or so of the wines that I tasted, many of them the most famous classified gross, and even including some of the first gross, were often not that interesting. And yet, over the last 30 years, there's been this, profound revolution in quality that has recognized the competition that exists throughout the world, has risen to that competition, and has continued to make Bordeaux the most recognized and the most singularly interesting wine in the world. There's a reason why Bordeaux is Bordeaux. And as much as I love a great Rioja from Spain or a great Malbec from Argentina or a great Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley, no one who produces wine today doesn't produce wine without comparing what they are doing with what Bordeaux does. Bordeaux is the reference. It is where really wine knowledge, wine quality starts and ends. The School of Enology in Bordeaux is possibly the best in the world. So much of what we learn about viticulture and winemaking emanates from Bordeaux. And we have seen Bordeaux, the best example of Bordeaux as a great wine is look at how consumers react to Bordeaux. They buy Bordeaux, they have confidence in Bordeaux. Bordeaux has an integrity, of course it has a history. We look at the auction markets, and certainly in Hong Kong, you're familiar with increasingly the number of auctions that are held here of vintage wines, and especially mostly driven by vintages of Bordeaux. And that these wines in the best vintages not only hold their price, they appreciate in price. And they appreciate in price because consumers, the people who actually end up pulling the cork and drinking them, have confidence in those wines. The wines have integrity, they have authenticity, and they have the ability to age for a very, very long period of time. And so Bordeaux has this very special quality. And as we go through this tasting this morning, I don't want to make it too technical because we will have a question and answer session. If you want to ask more technical questions, we certainly can. But Bordeaux is the epicenter of the wine world. It is where so much knowledge comes from and where so much quality comes from. And it's the largest producer of high quality wines in reasonably large quantities. You know, it's always interesting to find a wonderful little jewel of a property that makes 300 cases or 500 cases in Spain or Argentina or Italy or somewhere else. But most of the wines in front of you, and I'll give you tend to be made and the smallest is several thousand cases and the largest is over 20,000 cases. And that's why these wines have traveled the world and have a worldwide image of quality and authenticity. Now, we all know that Bordeaux, the history of Bordeaux is a rich history. It's a history that is basically was formed by the 1855 classification of the wines of the Médoc, and it was called of the Gironde. But it included one Grave wine, but everything else was in the Médoc. But Bordeaux is much more than that, and obviously we're going to taste some very great Médoc wines today. We're going to taste some very great wines from the Grave region. We're going to taste some very, very special wines from Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. And today, Bordeaux is, of course, all these famous regions, but it's also, today, we've seen a tremendous surge in the quality of wines from the satellites. They're not investment wines. They're not wines for speculation, but they're very, very good wines for everyday drinking and consumption. The revolution that started in Bordeaux, and I really think it did start around 20 to 25 years ago, I think first started in the vineyard. The vineyards, you have to remember that when I first went to Bordeaux in 1978, Bordeaux was coming out of a very large crisis in the 1970s. In the early 1970s, you had the international oil crisis. You had the collapse of certain currencies. You had the collapse of the fine wine market and the art market and other markets. And in the decade of the 1970s, you also had a succession of vintages that weren't very good in Bordeaux. You started off with a very good 1970 and a good 71, and then 72 and 73, 74 were very, very poor years. 75 people were excited about it initially, but as the wines have aged in the bottle, people have become less and less excited. And then you had 76, which was okay, but not very good. 77, which was poor. 78, which was okay. 79, which was okay. So it was not a very impressive decade. So Bordeaux had not made many investments. And then, of course, you had 1982, the vintage that really changed things for me in my professional life, because up until that point, I was a lawyer by training, but a wine lover 24/7, so to speak. And the quality of 1982 Bordeaux established my reputation as a serious wine critic, and it allowed people to buy Bordeaux as wine futures, and it pumped a lot of money into the Bordeaux economy. And you started seeing investments in the vineyards. You started seeing vineyards being replanted, the old sections of vineyards that were too old or diseased being torn up and replanted with younger vines that are now flourishing. You started seeing an emphasis on producing wines from lower crop yields. There is no secret. Any gardener out there or anybody that raises fruit or vegetables knows that if you have less fruit on a tree, you produce better fruit. And lower yields have certainly produced better quality wines, in addition to changes in viticulture, where there's been an overall movement to move to more less chemical farming, less industrial farming, to more natural farming, to more, moving toward more organic principles. We even have one wine here today that is made with the ultimate way, which is biodynamic farming, which is a real extreme way of very conservative viticulture. You also, in the 1980s, you had techniques introduced in Bordeaux that changed the quality of the wines dramatically. One of them was crop thinning, going through and actually cutting off partial or full bunches of grapes to reduce the crop size, to increase the concentration and potential of the grapes that were left on the vine. When this was first done, it was first done by the Muex family in Pomerol. It was done at Petrus, and the local farmers considered this an act against God, that to cut off what Mother Nature had given a farmer was an act against God. And how that's changed, because virtually every one of these estates that you'll be tasting today, and many, many more, routinely employ crop thinning as a way to control the crop, to get better fruit, and to regulate the crop. There have been significant changes in the cellars in Bordeaux, major investments, many progressive changements, simple things like temperature control and sanitation. The wines today are made so much better than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Everything is temperature controlled to avoid bacteria spoilage, to avoid things like volatile acidity, that is the smell of vinegar that can spoil wine. The temperature control allows very even fermentations. Today, almost all the new cellars are temperature controlled in the sense that, and they're computer controlled, where you can control through a touch what temperature you want this particular lot to vinify. Many techniques that are being used in Bordeaux today were actually adopted from hundreds of years ago in Burgundy, such as malolactic fermentation in barrel, which is just another process to allow the oak to be better integrated and to make the oak sweeter and more delicate in the early life of the wine. The selection process. Bordeaux has always had what we call second wines. The most famous being, of course, Pavillon de Chateau Margaux, or Four de la Tour, or the Clos de Marquis of Velasquez, or the Carrois de Lafite Rothschild. Second wines have existed for a very long time, and they've existed since the beginning 1900s. But the introduction of more second wines and the percentage of second wines started to accelerate in the 1980s and went on to the 1990s, where you have many of these chateaux that you're tasting today. The percentage of wine that they harvest and produce into wine, as much as 40, 50, sometimes as much as 60% of that entire production is what is called declassified and put under a second label. Sometimes they're third labels. All this is done not to try and keep the price level high, but to increase the quality of the top wine. And I think it's been very effective. The selection process that we've seen that is so severe extends in the vineyard in eliminating entire parts of vineyards that are not satisfactory. There's also been a movement to produce wines that are far more natural, with much less sulfur, with much less bruising techniques from the time the grapes are brought in to the time the grapes are fermented and the wines moved into fermentation tanks, moved into barrels, and moved into bottle by less bruising techniques such as gravity and gas. So all these things have made Bordeaux so much better. Obviously, one thing that often doesn't get raised is the power of the wine consumer, the power of you as a consumer to expect the best, that when you pay money for a high quality wine, you want high quality. And the demands of the consumer are increasing. The consumer is more and more informed all the time, not just through efforts that I make and my other colleagues in the wine criticism business make, but through blogs and the internet and even through the websites of the chateaus themselves. Never before has the wine consumer been so educated and has had so much information available to them. This has all brought a far more informed consumer, a more intelligent consumer. Just participating in a tasting like this of a great young vintage of Bordeaux is an incredible educational event. And I feel an overwhelming desire to share with you my perceptions of these wines, of what I think what makes wine great, and why these wines are what they are. One of the things that I've learned in 33 years tasting Bordeaux is that there are generally two types of great vintages in Bordeaux. There is the kind of vintage that is very opulent and exuberant and sumptuous, and really, when it's even in its youth, it's very impressive, and you almost feel like you could drink it from the barrel. These sort of vintages are rare. And there are vintages in the past, like 1921, that have been like this, like 1929, like 1947, like 1949, like 1959, and then more recently, like 1982 and 1990, 2003 to a certain extent, but certainly 2009 is in is in this school of great vintages that are relatively drinkable young. They have very sweet tannins, velvety tannins, and the wines have tremendous potential for longevity. But they also have what I consider very important. The window for drinking them is a very, very broad window. And that's one style of great vintages that Bordeaux produces. The other style that Bordeaux produces is a more, I don't like to use sexist terms, but more masculine, more virile, more powerful and robust with more tannin, very dense, very concentrated, but also backward and foreboding and almost difficult to understand when they're young. They're big wines, they're rich wines, but they're extremely tannic and they take time in the bottle. And unlike a vintage like 2009 or 1990 or 1982, where the window for drinking starts at the beginning and goes like this, these vintages are not very much fun to drink early on. These are vintages that are for very patient people who have the patience to wait for those tannins to melt away in the wine, for the wines to soften up. And that can take 5 years, it can take 10 years, it can take 15 years. In my experience, having had lots of optimism in the certain kinds of these vintages, it often takes longer than we have on planet Earth, and we lose our patience for them. But vintages like that, I think, would be certainly 1945, vintages like 1955 to a certain extent, 1961, which is a very great vintage, and probably more recently 2000 is like that. 2005 may very well be like that. And 2010 may turn out to be somewhat like that. So there are two really different kinds of great vintages in Bordeaux. We're going to be drinking one that I think is more easy to drink young. That's why I chose it, even though these wines have only been in the bottle for a few months. Before we start the tasting, I do want to share with you why or what I think constitutes a great wine. Wine is such a fascinating beverage. I have come to my field completely self-trained. I came from a family that never consumed wine. I never had the idea. I was from a farming family. But I went off to college, and I went off to France in 1967. And I would have preferred to have drunk Coca-Cola. I was 20 years old. But Coca-Cola was more expensive than the French, what they called the vin de table. So the girl I was seeing, who's my wife now, said, why don't you try some of the table wine? Because first of all, it's less expensive than Coca-Cola, and you're in France, you're not in the rural countryside of the United States. So I started drinking table wine in France, wine that I probably wouldn't dare touch today. But I was fascinated by it. It seemed to go with food. It seemed to promote conversation. It seemed to have what I call an incremental feeling of euphoria. And I had come out of college where beer was always sort of filling and very bloating, and liquor was quite numbing and very powerful and disabling, frankly. And here was this beverage that worked with food, that seemed to be different every night I had it. And keep in mind, I was drinking the least expensive wine possible. And it promoted conversation, it gave me a sense of euphoria, and it was different. And because of those experiences in the fall and winter of 1967, I came back to college in the United States. I started what was then the first of its kind, a wine tasting group with other students. And it was a crazy wine tasting group. And half of them were on illegal substances, so to speak, to be polite, but half of them were serious about tasting wine. And so we started learning about wine, and that's how I got interested. And there are two essentials about learning about wine. Keep your head open, your mind open, because there are great wines from all over the world. Today we're tasting at the very top of the pyramid, the greatest wines from the greatest region for wine in the world, in my opinion. But also, by keeping your mind open, don't believe anything that you read. Your palate, what you taste and what you think is far superior to anything that I can say. I can provide guidelines, I can give you my thinking, my rationale for why I think a wine is great, why I think a vintage is great, but the most important thing is you. Do you like it? And when you decide you like it, then it's the educational process of why you like it. And hopefully we can answer a few of those questions today. Now, what makes a wine great? We all know that people will tell you wine tasting is subjective. Subjective, it's a matter of personal taste. Okay, I agree with that up to a point. But it's also like saying, yeah, so is art appreciation, so is music appreciation, so is culinary appreciation. So you can say that, but at the same time, there's no one who disagrees that Joel Robuchon is one of the greatest French chefs that ever lived in the world. There are a few people who would disagree that 1982 is a great vintage, or 1990 is a pretty special vintage, or 2000 or 2005. There is a consensus as to what is good and great. And I think we can agree in many different areas. Where it gets troublesome are more extreme styles of wine. When you get into wines that can be at one end of the spectrum, underripe or overripe, or from unusual grape varietals, then you get into the controversy of what really this is. But today we're drinking, it should be easy, we're drinking modern day classic wines from a classic wine region. And I think when I look at what constitutes a great wine, there are a handful of elements that have to be satisfied for that wine to be great or profound. One of them is that a wine has to satisfy both your hedonistic and your intellectual senses. Wine is a beverage of pleasure. Let's not forget that. Beaujolais is pleasurable. Muscadet is pleasurable. But to come up to the next level of being intellectually challenging and pleasing at the same time is not easy. And to me, every great wine that I've ever had, it has the ability to satisfy my senses of pleasure as well as my intellectual senses. And intellectual meaning that the wine has nuances. It's like an artichoke that you're peeling or an onion you're peeling. That every time you go back to the glass, more things come out, and it unfolds, it unravels, and shows you more things. And what it shows you are all positive, things that you want to see it for. So this is a very important component to me of what makes a wine great. Secondly, all great wines have to offer a depth and an intensity of aroma and flavor without heaviness. The last two words are the key, without heaviness. It's easy today, especially in the New World, to make wines that are powerful and very rich and very alcoholic, but they're also heavy. They're very impressive, one glass, but do you want to drink a half bottle or a full bottle? The great thing about Bordeaux is usually when you have a really good one, you would like to drink the entire bottle. And I think it's the same thing, you can make an analogy to cuisine. Great cuisine of the world, whether it's Cantonese cuisine, whether it's French cuisine, or Italian, Spanish, whatever. What makes the dishes great is the intensity of smell and flavor without heaviness. You want something heavy? Have a double cheeseburger at one of America's restaurants. That's heavy food. So certainly the ability to offer intense aromas and flavors without heaviness is a component of a great wine. A third thing is relatively common sense. It's the ability of a wine to hold your interest. To hold your interest. When I have a glass of wine and I don't want a second glass, that wine's probably not that interesting. If you want to have a second glass, if you find something else there, that is important. You want that wine to pull you back. You want it to be like a magnet, to pull you back to it for some reason. Is it the smell? Did you smell a raspberry, or did you smell new saddle leather? Did you smell ginger? Whatever. You want that interest, and if it keeps pulling you back, that's a good sign, and usually a great wine. Certainly all the greatest wines in the world have the ability to improve with age. Now this is something that we talk about, we often exaggerate, but it is a birthright, and it's a noble component of any great wine in the world is the ability to improve with age. Every one of these wines in front of you today, I can say this because I probably won't be alive to be challenged, but every one of these wines will be alive in 30 years and probably 50 years. Some of them will probably still be pleasurable and complex 75 to 100 years from now, as hard as that is to believe. But that's one of the reasons you see the prices you do for Bordeaux. It's why people have confidence in Bordeaux. It's why people buy Bordeaux. And when I say the ability to improve, don't get caught in the rhetoric that, well, yeah, I make a wine and it will last 20 years. It will last 30 years. Well, a lot of New World wines, a lot of wines made will last, but they're no better in year 10 or year 20 than they were in year 1. Better in the sense that they're no more complex. They're the same. They're just lumps of alcohol and grape juice and wood and whatever that just move along on a timeline. Great wine improves. It becomes measurably more interesting, more complex, softer, and better as it ages. A wine has to have a singular personality. Think about it. When you've looked at great Chinese art or great French art or great Italian art, or you've listened to great music, whether it's Mozart, whether it's Brahms, whether any master, what makes it so great is its singular characteristics, its singular personality. Great wines have a personality that once you recognize, you won't forget. The same as great art, the same as great music, the same as great cuisine. I would do in a blind tasting a dish from Robuchon, the great French chef, blind, because he has a style, he has a personality. So that's very, very important. So these are, to me, the components of a great wine. So anyhow, I think the other points that I'll make during the tasting, but 2009 was essentially a vintage that was beautiful weather. The French have always had, not the French, but the Italians, just about every wine producing country in the Northern Hemisphere have the expression that June, the month of June makes the quantity, because that's when you have the flowering of the grapes, and that September, and now it's August, September, August make the quality. And what you had in 2009 was a very good growing season with even flowering, without any real problems of irregularity, which create a lot of problems. And you had an end of year without any problems. And so the Bordelais were able to harvest perfect grapes, untainted grapes, unrotted grapes of full maturity, and translate them into spectacular wines. So with that, we'll start the tasting. The arrangement, I arranged the order of the tasting because essentially arranging a tasting is like arranging a meal. You try and go from the more elegant and lighter styles that are more delicate. Not that they have plenty of concentration and plenty of complexity and stuff, but they're more delicate styles, and then move through the tasting to richer styles, more powerful styles, till you get to the end where you have perhaps the most exuberant, the most flamboyant and opulent wines. That was what I was trying to do in organizing this tasting. It's not easy with 20 wines, but hopefully I've done it. You'll be the judge of that. So with that, let's start this tasting. We're starting with Aubailly, and I would like, as I taste each one, I would like just the representative of the chateau to stand, because we should thank all of these representatives that have come from Bordeaux to participate and have offered these wines and participate in this tasting, and from Chateau Aubailly, which is a wonderful chateau in the Pessac-Léognan area in pure gravelly soil. It's one of the quintessentially most elegant expressions of Bordeaux that exists. I'm happy to say it's owned by an American now, and it's owned by the man that actually owns the bank that I bank with. But I banked with that bank long before he acquired Aubailly, so there's no conflict. Trust me. We have the representative from Aubailly, Veronique. Would you mind standing? And thank you. We talk about size, and I'm going to use the English acreage size. But if you're used to the metric system, hectares, you can take what I'm saying and divide by 2.4, and that will give you the number of hectares the estate is. Aubailly is a relatively small estate by Bordeaux standards. It's just under 80 acres, and you'll see as we have all these informational sheets, when they list the percentage of grapes, whether it's Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, or Cabernet Franc, these are often what is the representations of what is planted in the vineyard. The blends that are done at the chateau vary from year to year, and so depending on the year, if it's a very strong and impressive year for Cabernet Sauvignon, Veronique would be the first to tell you that perhaps a little bit more Cabernet Sauvignon might be used in the final blend. If it's a very strong Cabernet Franc or Merlot year, a little bit more of those grapes would be used in the blend. But generally, this is a wine that has a strong Cabernet presence, both Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon, and obviously a nice part of Merlot. Now, tasting young wine. By the way, I know Hong Kong has had a lot of great tastings. As the center of the wine world has moved from New York to Hong Kong, but perhaps maybe this is certainly the best tasting ever of great young wine. I don't know, Gil. What do you think? I think most of the wines that you're used to tasting are much older. So this will be an exercise in tasting, truly great young wine from a great vintage. Now you say, well, what do you look for? Certainly the most important thing to look for is what I call purity. That just like food or whatever, there should be the purity of flavors should be there. We don't want to smell a petrochemical plant. We don't want to smell any sort of garbagey things or off aromas or entirely vegetal characters. We want pure. The fruit should be very pure, and that fruit, certainly since it's a Bordeaux and we're dealing with the Bordeaux varietals, you're usually dealing with the blacker spectrum of fruits, black currants, occasionally red currants, black cherries, and as these wines have been opened, I'd say 2 hours?
2 or 3 hours ago.
2 or 3 hours ago, because a young vintage like this needs air. It needs air, and so the logistics of having a tasting for 1,000 people didn't permit us to decant these wines in advance, but they were opened well in advance, and by being poured in the glass, we're hoping that the aeration in the glass will open the wines a bit. I think you're going to find the wines in all different stages of development. Yeah.
Yeah, a short housekeeping announcement. I have to apologize. The tasting booklet that you have, I made numerous mistakes on the description of some of the wines and the chateau. I apologize to the chateau representatives, and I recommend you to follow Bob's description of the wine. So sorry about that.
In addition to purity, and I'm finding this in the Aubailly, what I'm also looking for is, and certainly the Chinese would appreciate this probably more than many cultures, is the perfect equilibrium. If you take a wine and you deconstruct the wine, okay, what is it? You have the fruit extract, which comes from the grapes. You have tannin, which is the astringent substance that comes from the skins of the grapes. You have acidity. You have the influence of the wood barrels in which it's aged in. You have alcohol. And what I'm looking for in these very young wines is perfect symmetry, a perfect equilibrium, so that I don't want the wood to dominate, I don't want the alcohol to dominate, I don't want the acidity to dominate. So you're looking for the complete balance. And I think you see in this first wine a beautifully balanced wine with very silky tannins. The tannins are present, but they are silky and what I call beautifully integrated. The fruit character is very ripe, but not overripe. Overripe is suggested by figs, by prunes, And I don't see any of that. I see beautifully pure red and black fruits in the wine. And how this wine ages, as the wine ages, Bordeaux, if you had to graft a great vintage of Bordeaux, Bordeaux is like this, a very slow progression for 10, 20, 30 years, improving all the way, shedding, dropping its tannin, dropping some of the fruit. The acidity stays the same, the alcohol will stay the same. And then it hits its peak, which in a vintage like this could be 25 years, it could be 35 years, depending on the wine. It could be longer, because storage is important. We haven't talked about it, but if you're going to buy these wines for drinking in 10 or 15 years, you have to be sure you have a wine cave or refrigerated storage for them. And then as a Bordeaux begins its decline, and it's one of the reasons people still pay high prices for very old vintages of Bordeaux, is that even as it's declining, the decline is very, very slow. In contrast, other kinds of wines from thinner skinned grapes, such as Pinot Noir, Nebbiolo, can age more like this, a much more faster trajectory, and then they hit the peak, and it's a much shorter period. But again, it tends to, and then the decline is relatively quick. Bordeaux has this huge window again, and so it's up to your personal taste whether you prefer the wines young, fruity, exuberant, and fresh, or do you prefer them more aged, or do you prefer them actually much older when you start getting more mushroomy characters and more sort of, old building and old room smells? Not unpleasant, but just these smells of subtle decay. So I find this wine extremely well balanced. It's always, I know from doing these for 33 years, the first wine in a tasting is always the most difficult challenge, because you have to start somewhere, and we started with Obayi, but it's always difficult until your palate basically is getting acclimated and you're getting adjusted to these wines. But I think this wine is very impressive, beautifully pure. It's a classic of what it should be, which is Obayi, which is the quintessentially elegant style of Grave, with supple tannins, a beautiful subtleness to it, but with intensity. We go back to the intensity of flavors. Well, it looks like I'm spitting. I'm actually probably going to swallow a little bit of each one, because these are too good to spit completely. So, the second wine, we're going to move north, probably by about, I'd say, 30 miles, 25 miles, due north to the appellation of Margaux. And we're tasting one of the wines that was very highly rated in the famous 1855 classification of the wines of Bordeaux. This was a second growth, and not just any second growth. It was right behind Mouton Rothschild, which was a second growth in that classification. And of course, this is a Margaux, and this wine is another wine that is basically split between a little bit more Cabernet Sauvignon, but a lot of Merlot in it, and some Petit Verdo and Cabernet Franc. When you look at the four major grapes, and we have the representative Rosan Seigle here. I didn't see John Colasso, but whatever. Well, I guess we don't. But this is a very, very respected property that is owned, now it's owned by the Wertheimer family, that are the owners of the haute couture house in Paris, Chanel. And they've invested in Bordeaux. They've purchased Chateau Rosan Seigle. They purchased a property in Saint-Emilion called Chateau Canon. And this wine has a great history. It is, to me, a classic Margaux. It's right in the heart of Margaux. I mean, it faces Chateau Palmer and Chateau Margaux, so it's beautifully situated. And this is a wine that's never going to be a very powerful wine. It's never going to be the most exuberant, intense wine, but it has a delicacy and a finesse that I think is what people expect from Margaux. Now, when we talk about the grapes that are blended into a Margaux, every chateau has the choice of what they believe should be planted in their vineyards depending on the soils. Certainly in Margaux, you have very, very high percentage of gravel, so you tend to see a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon in the Margaux area. You also see a lot of Merlot in parts. And in fact, we're going to have Chateau Palmer a little bit later, which is is almost eccentric in the sense that they have such a very high percentage of Merlot in their blend. But when you look at these building blocks, there are basically three grapes that dominate Bordeaux. There's Cabernet Sauvignon, which of course dominates in the Médoc, and to a certain extent, there's a good bit of it in the Grave. There's virtually none of it in Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. And Cabernet Sauvignon produces, it's the quintessential antioxidant grape. I mean, it is very resistant to oxidation. It's the thickest skin. It produces the darkest color, produces the most highly pigmented wines, and also the wines that potentially have the highest level of tannins by itself. By itself, it's often has problems because it needs a blending grape to soften this very, very big style. And so often it is blended with Merlot. Merlot is widely planted throughout the Médoc. It's not as widely planted as Cabernet Sauvignon in the Médoc, but you see a lot more of it in the Grave section to the south of the Médoc, and you see quite a bit of it in Saint-Emilion, and you see very large proportions of it in Pomerol, where most of the highest concentrations of Merlot are located. Merlot is a thick-skinned grape as well compared to something like Pinot Noir or Nebbiolo, but it's not as thick-skinned as Cabernet Sauvignon. It produces wines with slightly less saturated purple-black color compared to Cabernet Sauvignon, but it also produces sweeter and lighter tannins, and it tends to produce slightly more sugar, so it tends to produce more what we call fat or succulence or flesh. And so it's an ideal candidate for blending with Cabernet Sauvignon to make Cabernet Sauvignon more complex and to soften up Cabernet Sauvignon. It also blends beautifully with the third great varietal in Bordeaux, which is Cabernet Franc, which is a very perfumed grape, you don't see a lot of Cabernet Franc in the Médoc. It's fallen out of favor. You see a good bit of it in the Grave. You see a lot of it in Saint-Emilion, and you see some in Pomerol, but most of the really top Cabernet Franc seems to emerge from Saint-Emilion and to a lesser extent in the Grave. And so Merlot blends beautifully with Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Franc by itself generally will not produce a big wine or a very rich wine, but it produces a very delicate, very complex, very cerebral, intellectual wine. So when you blend it with Merlot, which produces more flesh and fat, you have something very interesting. And when you blend it with Cabernet Sauvignon, it brings the Cabernet, makes it more civilized and more complex. And of course, you have the chance of blending all three together, which is often done. And the fourth grape, which you don't see much of, is Petit Verdo. And Petit Verdo is the last to ripen. It produces the wines with the darkest color, the most tannin. It's almost impossible to make 100% Petit Verdo and be able to drink it within your own lifetime. It's extremely tannic, but it does add structure, it adds color, and it adds a framework, a very impressive framework. So anyhow, we will see some Petit Verdo, especially with wines like Palmer and Pishon Baron that use it. I think that they'd be better off to tell you, but I think you see a higher percentage there because they use so much Merlot, and they use Petit Verdo as a structural element to buttress and to support their wines. You want to say something, Pancho? This wine's a little bit more, this bottle's seeming a little bit more restrained aromatically to me than the Aubailly in the mouth, though again, I get the beautiful, gentle tannins. And tannins, the tannins, which are the same thing that you find in great tea, You know, it's the tannin component that exists in black tea or green tea is very similar texturally to what you find in Bordeaux red wines. And you want that tannin to be present but not to be aggressive. If it's too aggressive, it becomes almost like something very astringent and very rough being taken and passed over your palate, and that's not good. And I think we've seen in these first two wines what I call essentially ideal tannins. The tannins are sweet, they're velvety, and they're beautifully well integrated into the wines. Keep in mind, the challenge for all of you is that we're tasting young wines that are at the very, very beginning of their life. All these wines have been in the bottle probably anywhere from 3 to 6 months, but no more. And so they are, a lot of people will say we're committing infanticide here today, but this is how you learn. And I think it's a great opportunity to taste a young vintage. And what happens is once these wines have been in bottle for a year or two, they begin to close. You know, it's almost someone takes a key and puts it in a lock. And then they become very challenging to taste until they start developing, which could be 10 or 15 years. We're still catching them in their very primary stage where they've been bottled and the fruit is still very, very present and you can still see their personality and it hasn't begun to lock down or shut down. So the first two wines, I think, are performing what I would think they would perform in this vintage. We're going to move on to another Margaux, which is very close to Rosane-Seigle, brand Cantenac, and we have the proprietor, Monsieur Lurton, here, if he would be happy to stand. This is a very famous estate, another property that was well placed in the famous 1855 classification. It's another property that has made remarkable improvements over the last 20 years. When I first went to Bordeaux, since I've written many books, it's easy to go back and look. I didn't write very nice things about brand Cantenac. And now it's one of my favorite wines when I taste in Bordeaux. And I think Henri Lurton has done a magnificent job, and he's done many of the things that I talked about earlier about selection, selection, selection. There have been major investments in the vineyard. There have been major investments in the wine cellars at brand Cantenac. Now there is a strict selection process that only the very best of what their staff believes is great wine is bottled as brand Cantenac. And I think over the last decade, this is one of the most perfumed, aromatically seductive wines that you can find in Bordeaux. And then, of course, its charm, and I think this is what brand Cantenac has long been famous for. Its charm is its almost irresistible ability to be delicious in its youth, yet age for a very long time. And of course, this wine, again, we're looking at a wine that is primarily made from Cabernet Sauvignon with a good bit of Merlot and to a lesser extent Cabernet Franc. This is one of the larger vineyards that you're going to taste today. This is a vineyard that is 250 acres, which is very good size. And so it's a wine that is well represented in the export markets. Again, I think we really get a very, very relatively fascinating aromatic bouquet here of ripe fruit, of almost what I call forest floor. If you walk in a forest or the smell of sort of underbrush and under vegetation in a forest, lots of black fruits that are ripe, and again pure. I chose all these wines because I think they're great wines. They are the magical 20 today, and I also think that purity is such an important component that I think you're going to see that here. Again, we get this sort of a medium to full-bodied wine, very velvety tannin. I think a really beautiful opulence in the mouth that sort of builds very gradually, very nice aftertaste. Now, people talk about the importance of a wine's finish, which can also be called aftertaste. And what that really is when whether you spit a wine or you swallow the wine, it's the perception of the wine still being in your mouth after you've expectorated it or you've swallowed it. And first of all, the finish should be pleasant. It shouldn't be aggressive. It shouldn't be alcoholic. It shouldn't be astringent. It shouldn't be acidic. And a length can be, the length of a finish is often important. And a very good length of a wine can be 20 seconds. It can be 30 seconds. It can sometimes go longer than that. But it's this idea that the wine is, you still can taste the wine. And the reason for that is that the wine has this level of concentration that after you've spit it out or swallowed it, the heat, your internal body temperature of your palate still has the residue of the wine on it. And what it's doing, it's discharging what's left there up to your olfactory senses, and you still have this perception that the wine is there. And that is the finish of a wine. I think this is beautifully balanced, perfectly balanced wine. We're going to take questions at the end of the tasting, so I mean, I almost wish I could take them now, but we can't do that, right? No. Okay, at the end of the tasting, we'll take questions. So, very complex. I think you start to get some really. You're starting to see really some almost secondary aromas develop, which is good. I mean, I wasn't sure we'd see too many of those today with such young wines. The fourth wine is another Margaux, Velasquez Saint-Exupéry. We're back to a relatively small property of just under 60 acres, which is not very big, owned by the Zuger family, and we have a representative of Velasquez here. This was a third growth in the classification, but I think all these wines, to me, are making wines that are of first growth quality, which is almost when you say something like that, I think these wines justify, in terms of pure quality, they can stand on the same table with the great first growths, which are obviously fabulous wines. I mean, the likes of the Chateau Margaux, Lafite Rothschilds, and all you have to do is have blind tastings with these wines in there, and I think my point would be proven. Beautifully rich bouquet. One thing you often see in young wines that you have to be a little careful of is that tasting young Bordeaux that has just been bottled is often the oak. The oak is at its most dominant point, the barrels that the wine is aged in. Most chateaus use anywhere from 30% new oak to 100% new French oak barrels. And usually in the very early stages of the bottling, after they're bottled, the oak is at its very dominant point, and then it starts to subside. And obviously, good winemaking, it completely disappears with age. And I'm surprised with these 2009s, I'm really not smelling a lot of new oak on the wines. This wine has just beautiful black fruits to me and a little floral character, which I find very attractive. And I do pick up a little oak there in the mouth, but again, I think you're seeing in these first four wines the very style of this vintage, which is a vintage of silky tannins, of ripe fruit, of opulence, almost a voluptuous texture, and a vintage that, I mean, it's very difficult to compare with another vintage. But I think stylistically, this is in the same family as vintages like 1982 or 1990. Again, the characteristics of purity and again, intensity without heaviness. This idea that this wine is rich. It fills the mouth, but there's not a sense of fatigue or a sense of heaviness when you have it in your mouth. And that's great. That's great terroir. That's great winemaking. Well, we're going to finish our tour of Margaux with Chateau Palmer, which of course has the very distinctive black. I think all the bottles are in front of me, right, Pancho? Yep. Which has the very distinctive black label, which really does stand out. I think that was probably wasn't thought of at the time, but it was, marketing genius with that label. This is a wine, as I said, that somewhat atypically has a lot of Merlot in it. Usually can be as much as 50% or more Merlot, and the balance is largely Cabernet Sauvignon with a healthy dosage of Petit Verdo. And I know we have someone from Chateau Palmer representing. Thomas, would you like to stand up? Thank you. Thomas has some extraordinary experience. He actually worked in Italy making the wines of Ornellaia in Tuscany before he came to Chateau Palmer. So he knows his Merlot well, I would say. But this is a bigger estate than Malascaux Saint-Exupéry, but not as large as Brand Cantenac. It's just under 130 acres in size. It's been one of the great classic names in Bordeaux for as long. This was one of the top names when I started going to Bordeaux, and they've just gotten better and better and better over the years. These are wines that can last 40 or 50 years, but because of the high Merlot component, they tend to be generally approachable and accessible young. Beautifully dark, sort of dark plums and dark black currants, fruit, and very saturated color. All these wines have very, very healthy color. Of the wines we've tasted so far, this wine comes across to me as the richest, the most opulent, the deepest in terms, and that's hopefully, if I've got the order correctly, this will continue. As we're going from the more delicate and complex and sublime ethereal styles to more powerful, richer styles of wine. The key is when you leave here this morning is hopefully I will have presented a very diverse group of wines to you, of very different styles. Because the key is for you to determine, well, what do I like and why do I like it? And maybe I like the Margaux better than the Pomerols. Maybe I like the Graves more than the Médocs, etc. And but hopefully you'll like them all. So, but this is a very impressive wine, very rich, and I think has tremendously long aging potential. And again, I don't sound like a broken record, but to reiterate, very pure, extremely pure wine. Wine number 6. We're going to make a little transition here, and we're going to move back south to a wonderful estate called Smith-O-Lafitte. And this is owned by the Cathillard family, and we have them here today. I think we have both Cathillards here. Where are they? Oh, they're there. They are a great story. This is another estate that when I first went to Bordeaux in 1978, these were not very good wines. And in fact, I had a hard time giving them good reviews at all. And but they acquired this estate, I think it was in 1990 or 91, and it was a complete resurrection of quality in a few short years. And Smith-O-Lafitte now, which is 165 acres. And again, it's, the Cabernet Sauvignon is the most important component, around 55%, and then the rest Merlot and some Cabernet Franc. And they also make an exquisite white wine. Most of the great chateaux in the Grave region also make a white wine. Aubailly is probably the exception. If they make a white wine, they're keeping it a secret, but they're not. But Smith Lafitte makes a spectacular white wine that I highly recommend. But their red wines have been sensational for under the administration of the Cathayards. And again, this is an example of investment, of putting money into the vineyard, into the wine cellars, and making a selection process, and doing everything the right way. And I think that we sometimes discount the passion that these producers bring to these estates. And I know people don't like change, and people are always against, there's always a lot of noise when some large insurance company or some corporation purchases an estate-owned, a family-owned property in Bordeaux, and there are cries of fear and what's going to happen. And in my experience, in the 33 years I've been doing it, every acquisition by an outside family corporation has resulted in dramatically improved quality. And that speaks to their understanding of the world marketplace and of their passion for producing high-quality wine. This has a beautiful, one of the great characteristics of great Bordeaux and great vintages is almost a cassis smell. It's the liqueur of black currants, and sometimes you get a little licorice with it. And as that ages, you will start seeing more of the earthiness that often develops in Grave wines at age 10, 15, or 20. This has this beautifully pure cassis. And again, quite a rich wine. This is probably the first wine where we start to see more structure, we start to see more tannins, and I think we see sort of an evolution here of the more delicate, more supple styles. We get the Palmer, and we start to see a transition to a bigger, richer style of wine. And now Smith Lafitte, you start to see an overlay of a much more structure and potential for they all have potential for longevity, but I think you see it in this particular wine. I hope you're enjoying these wines as much as I am. You think I take these things for granted, and I think the one thing about wine tasting, whether I'm tasting at home and drinking and tasting, or doing something like this, which is somewhat rare, is that I never take it for granted, because I think it's the most fascinating beverage in the world. And the one thing about being a wine critic or being a wine consumer, because at the end of the day, I am a wine consumer. It's hard to believe sometimes, I know, but I'm a consumer just like those of you who are consumers, is that you always remain a student in this game. No matter how much you know, how much you learn, every new vintage is like going back to school. And that's what I think has sustained me for these 30 plus years. It's energized me. Certainly the efforts of all these producers that we have here today and what they've done during the time period in which I've been going to Bordeaux is an incredibly motivating force to see how the quality has improved so dramatically. And as I said, Smith Lafitte, I could hardly review because it was not that good when I first went to Bordeaux in the late 70s, and now it's one of the stars every year, like all these wines are. All right, I guess we should keep on schedule, right? So, sorry for running a little behind. Number 7 is Pap Clemont, which is another Grave, but we're dealing here with a Grave that is not in this. Aubailly and Smith Lafitte are the two Graves we've had so far, are much closer to each other in the southern portion of the Léognan Pessac area. Pap Clemont is, if you've ever visited Pap Clemont is actually in the city of Bordeaux. It's in a suburb. It's in Pessac. but you would think you're still in the city of Bordeaux when you go there. Of course, this has a great deal of history. It's owned by Bernard Magret, and we have his representative here. Mr. Magret had back surgery and couldn't be here, so we have Mr. Magret's representative, who, if he would stand, yes. This is a vineyard that is literally within basically a city. It's a few miles from Chateau Aubryon, which is also in the same area. And the property itself has got tremendous history. It's obviously named after a French pope named Pap Clemont, who was a French pope in the 1300s. And those of you who have visited France probably know that if you've been to southern France and you've been to the walled town of Avignon, he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, and this property, which is named after him, is a modestly sized property of about 80 plus acres, and unlike the other properties we've tasted so far, is a blend of just two grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, and it's meticulously made. Bernard Magret is like most of these proprietors that we're meeting here and representatives. He's a perfectionist. He's obsessed. He pushes the envelope. I think every year he has about 150 people on his table of what they call the Triage Table, which is a sorting table. It's a sorting table when the grapes come in and the grape pickers dump the grapes on these conveyor belts. He has two basically small armies on each side pulling out defective grapes, stems, pieces of vegetal material, whatever. Of course, all this is changing because of technology. You now have lasers that can sort the grapes. So things are changing dramatically, but sorting is a very, very important process in making fine wine, and they're very serious here about sorting. This is a wine that probably has more new oak in its aging than any of the wines we've had so far. It's a very rich style, very full-bodied style. The microclimate at Pap Clemont is a warmer microclimate than you have at Smith-O-Lafitte or at Aubailly, simply because of the influence of the city of Bordeaux. This is again, beautiful fruit, tremendous purity, equilibrium, balance, which is so essential. It's all there. This is a very nicely concentrated wine, but not overdone. It's not overripe. It's not underripe. Beautifully balanced. And if we had to sort of say, in 10 years, the aromatics, the perfume on these wines will increase by 5-fold, 10-fold. In 20 years, probably by 25-fold. That's what happens. The aromatics become, as the wine is trapped in the bottle with no oxygen other than what can possibly penetrate a cork, they develop nuances and aromatics. And that's what will happen with all these wines. And so we're seeing aromatics today that are there, but much more primary. So that's a very impressive wine. Now, in this sort of Wine 101 in Hong Kong, and by the way, I don't think anybody on planet Earth is tasting better wine between 10 and midday than we are here in Hong Kong this morning. And maybe this afternoon you're going to some other tasting, but I think this is, it would be hard to duplicate the quality of these wines anywhere in the earth today. So I feel privileged, but
And also, can you give me the sound, please? Yeah, and also because we are broadcasting live stream, there's about 2,000 or 3,000 people more watching the tasting from their homes all over the world.
Well, they have to be very envious, and I apologize that they can't be here to enjoy this. But We're going to change gears here, and the next four wines, we're going to take a immersion course in the great wines of the smallest famous appellation of Bordeaux, and of course that is Pomerol. And I have a special place for Pomerol because when I first went to Bordeaux, I remember, everyone talked about the Médoc and people talked about the Grave, but no one said much about Pomerol. And yet I'd had these wines that were absolutely spectacular. This is where Merlot is king, for the most part. And the properties are very small compared to the properties in the Médoc. And those of you who go there, it's almost, in the Médoc, everything is basically these great, these superb chateaux. When you get to Pomerol, the word chateau sort of goes out of existence, and it's more like farmhouses and small properties. And I remember when my wife and I were first there, and we had Hugh Johnson's Atlas of Wine, and we wanted to see Petrus. And so we were following and they're very good maps in that book, by the way. And so we were driving around, and we were on what was called the Plateau of Pomerol, which is this elevated area where a lot of the best estates are. And we said, we have to be close to Petrus. We've got to be right there. This is a tiny appellation. And so at that time, I didn't speak any French, but my wife was fluent in French. And so we saw these men working in a field. I said, why don't you ask them where Petrus is? So she goes over and she talks to them, and she comes back and said, they have no idea. I said, this is frustrating. I said, it's got to be right here. So she gets in the car. We literally drove another 100 feet, and there was a building that said Petrus. And so what I'm saying is that these peasants who are working in a field, working within a couple hundred meters of Petrus, didn't know it. And it just struck me as like, this appellation needs more recognition. And of course today, in the last 33 years, things have changed dramatically. Everyone recognizes how many great wines come from Pomerol. We talk about Bordeaux being the reference point for the wines of the world. Pomerol's the reference point for Merlot. I think that the wines, there's a lot of ways I could describe them, but one way is they're sexy. There's no other way to put it. They're sexy wines, and they're sexy because there's a lot of, most of them have anywhere from 65, 70% to 90, 95% to 100% Merlot in them. And the Merlot flourishes in Pomerol because you have a lot of clay in parts. On the Saint-Emilion border, you have a lot of clay and gravel. And they often have an advantage in years where the rains come, because the Merlot ripens a good week to 2 weeks ahead of Cabernet Sauvignon, and they often can harvest much of their crop before the rains come in. So we have a fabulous selection, because it's hard to get them because they're such limited in production. We're starting with a wine you rarely ever see in a tasting. It's got one of the most famous names in the world, Lafleur Patrice. And just about anyone would tell you that probably the two most famous estates of Pomerol are Petrus and Lafleur. But this is a property that is sort of sandwiched in between both of them, called Lafleur Patrice. It's been owned by the Muex family for many, many years, and it's a small estate of just over 30 acres, so there's not much of it. And this is a wine that is primarily Merlot, usually about 85%, and the rest Cabernet Franc. And it's a wine of great complexity, of wonderful suppleness, and one of the myths about Pomerol is that, well, people say, well, the wines age quickly. Well, they may be ready to drink and may reach their point of maturity much sooner than a Grave or a Médoc, but they stay there for a long time because of their balance, and that makes them especially appealing. Here you start getting into, I always find with Merlot, you start seeing more plum and mocha and occasionally caramel. Sometimes you see, but just a beautiful smell to it. And I think it's like silk in the mouth. I mean, there's a tendency sometimes to say, because we've been tasting some bigger wines. I mean, like the Pap Clemont, the Palmer, that they're bigger, richer wines. This is just pure silk and seduction. I think he's going to buy the entire world production of Lafleur Patrice. Beautiful finish on that wine. I mean, totally round, generous, just quite beautiful. Now, the thing about all these properties is that all these properties you could actually throw. If you were a good frisbee thrower, you could probably stand at Lafleur Patrice. You have to be probably pretty good, but you could almost hit Le Concione. You could almost hit Le Gay. You could certainly hit Patrice. You wouldn't be able to hit Trot Noir, but they're all very close. And I think when first-time visitors go there, that's one of the shocking things, is that they're basically all on top of each other, these little vineyards. The second one is Le Concione.
Well, before we on, can we acknowledge the...
Yes, I'm sorry. Edward, would you please stand up? We have a member of the Muex family here. Edward used to be the most eligible bachelor in France, but that's all changed. And of course, Edward is his father is Christian Muex, who was just honored in New York by the Wine Spectator as the Man of the Year, which was well deserved. And congratulations to him. Edward is also representing Trot Noir, and the Muex family. The Muex family is basically synonymous with putting Pomerol on the map. It was Edward's grandfather, Jean-Pierre Muex, who I had the real honor of meeting and getting to know reasonably well, that believed in Pomerol long before anyone else did. And I remember him telling the stories of going up in his car to Belgium and the northern countries to try and sell the wines, which were not well known. They were not covered in the books on Bordeaux. And it took decades, but finally they received the recognition, and of course today are among the most cherished wines of the world. And we see here, we see a wonderful generation. I mean, when I first went, it tells you how old I am, I guess, is that when I first went to Pomerol, I dealt with his grandfather, and then I dealt with his father, and of course now I deal with Edward. So I'm dealing with the entire family over the course of my career. But anyhow, moving on to Le Concione, since we should have the representative of Le Concione please stand as well, since we have a property that's very close by. And this is another very small property. It's pretty much the same size as Lafleur Patrice, a little bit smaller. It's about 30 acres. Great location. Le Concione sits basically on what we'd call it's not really a downslope, but it's the other side of Patrice. But it's next to L'Evangile, which of course is now owned by the Rothschilds that own Lafite. And across the street is Saint-Emilion, and the vineyard that they face is Cheval Blanc. So it's a beautiful location. Again, this has always been one of the most elegant wines of Pomerol. You could almost say if Le Concione might be like the Brand Cantenac, or the Brand Cantenac, as Brand Cantenac is to Margaux and Aubailly is to Grave. Maybe Le Concione is one of the more elegant, sublime, very ethereal Pomerols. And again, this is mostly Merlot, but with a little bit more Cabernet Franc in it than Lafleur Patrice, about 20%. When I first went there used to be a higher percentage of Cabernet Franc. And I actually recall back in those days there was some Cabernet Sauvignon. Never? Oh, okay. Malbec? Okay, a little bit. But again, it's a wine of seduction. I mean, it's a wine that is just difficult to resist. Beautiful. I mean, beautiful. I always get sort of raspberries and very ripe black cherries fruit in this wine, and a floral character. It's just a beautifully seductive set of aromatics. And again, we see that same silkiness, tenderness, delicacy, very soft tannins. Now, I'm sure some people are going to say, are the tannins in these wines too soft? Because we're so used to wines where the tannins have a bite to them. This is one of the great qualitative improvements that's been made in vinification in Bordeaux, is that the tannin levels in Bordeaux in modern vintages are as high, if not higher, than they've ever been. But because of the care in which the wines are vinified, and because they're using fully mature fruit, the tannins are sweeter, and they're not aggressive as they used to be in the past. And there's a lot of things I could tell you in a short period of time, but I remember in my early days as a wine taster, I was troubled over a vintage I was tasting because the wines, I was only had 4 or 5 years experience, and the wines seemed too tannic. They were bitter, they were hard, they were green. And I was talking to this old vigneron, and I said, I have a hard time understanding this vintage. And he looked at me and he put his hand on my shoulder like he was talking to his child. And he said, well, as a wine critic, sooner or later you're going to have to understand the cardinal rule. I said, what's that? He said, if the wine tastes too tannic, and I'm waiting for this epiphany, I said, what? He says, if the wine tastes too tannic, it is too tannic. And I think that simplicity is something none of you should ever forget, because tannins are always in these wines. There's never been a Bordeaux made that didn't have plenty of tannin. There will never be a Bordeaux made ever that doesn't have plenty of tannin. But the flawed Bordeaux and the old style Bordeaux, which a lot of them never matured properly, or because the tannins were too bitter, they were too tannic. You have more tannins in most of these wines than you have in the great old vintages, but the tannins are softer and sweeter. So the tannins are there. I'm just trying to anticipate, because when I taste wines like Lafleur Patrice or La Concione, in fact, most of these wines, the tannins are there, but they're silky. And I guarantee you, analytically, there are plenty of tannins in these wines. Okay, we should move on. We have probably it's been one of my personal favorites for many, many years, Chateau Trotanoy. We have Edward Muex again to thank for this wine. This has been owned by the Muex family since 1953. This is a different style. I hope when you taste this is a very different style of Pomerol than La Concione or Lafleur Patrice. This is a style that's more macho, more masculine, richer, fuller, often needing a little bit more time. It's not quite as charming, early on as La Concione, Lafleur Patrice would be. But there's always a density to it, and there's always a sort of a very strong mineral component in this wine that you could call earthiness or whatever, but it ages magnificently. For many years before Patrice became so expensive and so well known, the real insider's wine to buy in Pomerol was Trotanoy, because it was, even though it didn't taste like Patrice, it aged just as well, and it was a lot less expensive. This is about 90% Merlot and 10% Cabernet Franc. It's a vineyard that's very deep gravel soils over clay. And you can even smell there's a distinctive, more pronounced earthiness in this wine. It's more tannic, it's richer, it's a denser wine. And again, it's like comparing apples and oranges. I mean, this is a brilliant, brilliant wine, but it's a very different style than La Concione or Lafleur Patrice. Petit When I set up this tasting, our last Pomerol is Chateau Le Gay, and we have Madame Verger here. Catherine, would you stand up? Yeah. She's another great example of a person coming to Bordeaux, investing, buying properties, and raising the level of quality dramatically. And what she's done at Chateau Leguay is quite remarkable. This used to be run by two old maids that I remember visiting when I was still a lawyer, long before I even practiced law. In 1975, I went to Leguay, and these two elderly ladies came out from the nearby town of Libourne on their bicycles to see me. And they took me into the cellars, and the cellars were inhabited by chickens, rabbits, and the barrels were filthy, covered with dung. And I'm thinking, how could you make good wine in these conditions? Well, now it's a much more beautiful place and a much more architecturally pleasing place. But Leguay, stylistically, is a wine that is, it's a tiny vineyard. It's under 20 acres. It's a blend of Merlot and Cabernet Franc, close to equal parts. So you see the strength of Cabernet Franc that comes here, along with the Merlot. And Leguay has always been known as a very powerful wine, a long-aged wine, and an intense wine. And I think Catherine, you're making just great wines, and wines for long-term aging. And this is a beautiful nose. I mean, you get the earthiness that you saw in the Trot Noir. You get the very ripe fruit. Beautiful, rich, full, textured. I mean, we always talk about a texture. And I've been told I'm taking way too long, so I'm going to have to speed up here. But when we try, and if you had to look at the texture of a great wine and plot it out in 3 dimensions, I mean, it sort of goes like this and like this. And a great wine does that. A little wine, a simple wine, is like this and like this. And I think all these wines, you see wines that do this and do that. All right, we're going to go back to the Médoc, to the northern Médoc, and we have 2 Saint-Juliens, and I apologize if I have to move, but you have a business to run, I know, and whatever. And we're going to taste 2 of the most famous estates in Saint-Julien, 2 very large estates. Number 12 is Les Velasquez, which is 240 acres, and it's normally at least 2/3 Cabernet Sauvignon, and the rest Merlot and Cabernet Franc, a little Petit Verdo, owned by the Delon family, and we have a representative of Les Velasquez here. Thank you. I don't think it's always considered one of the great classics. Long before I came on the scene, many people thought they were making wines of first growth quality, wines that can age 30, 40, 50 years. It's a magnificent vineyard. They use about 50 to 65% new oak, rarely more than that. I get what I call graphite or lead pencil shavings in the nose of this, along with a lot of the cassis and the black cherries. Again, you see the great characteristic of this vintage, and why I think it's such a great vintage, is you see Les Velasquez can almost be impenetrable in its youth, with the tannins just overwhelming. And here there's plenty of tannin, but the tannins are so sweet and velvety and integrated that it's accessible, which is unusual for a young Les Velasquez, and I think that's a sign of a very, very great vintage. The Les Poifferet, which is owned by the Cuvelier family, is a 200-acre estate, and I think do we have somebody from Poifferet here? Don't know. Oh, there we go. These were, once Poifferet and Lascaz were once part of one large, huge estate, and of course broken out. This is slightly smaller than Lascaz, but still very good size of 200 acres. The blend is essentially similar, with perhaps a little bit more Merlot in Poifferet than at Lascaz, and the percentage of new oak used in the cellaring of the wine is slightly higher. And this again, I think this is just a lesson in classic, cassis and the black currants, the licorice, the earth. the floral character of great Cabernet in a beautiful vintage. I mean, stunning. I mean, again, you get in these stunningly intense aroma. And again, back to one of my earlier comments, I said Merlot never produces wines with the color saturation of Cabernet, and you see that if you look at the colors. These Medocs that we're going to generally finish with are a much denser color than the Merlots. Beautifully full wine, rich, opulent. Lots there. I mean, this is a wine that, anyone that has access to these wines, the best advice I could give you today is buy them and forget them for a while. And if you don't forget them, enjoy them anyhow. They're really quite beautiful wines. Sorry to move on fast, but the next wine is one of the great classic wines of Pauillac, Pishon Longueville Comtesse de Lalande. This is the last vintage that was made before it was sold to the Rousseau family, that are best known as the owners of Louis Roeder Champagne. And we have one of the ancien regime from Pishon Lalande. And a state that is, certainly in the United States, this has always been one of the most popular of the classified growth Bordeaux for many, many years. Again, it's a relatively large estate of just over 200 acres. It has it's somewhat an unusual blend for a Pauillac, in that, like Palmer in the Margaux appellation, there's a great deal of Merlot usually in the blend at Pishon Lalande. And of course, they use a lot more Petit Verdo, as does Palmer, that I think they use to sort of build some structure because they have so much Merlot. And this wine, people often refer to it as more Saint-Julien than Pauillac. I'm not sure I agree with that. I just think among the great Pauillacs, it's a softer, silkier style of Pauillac than some of the more northern Pauillacs, like Latour and Lafite and Mouton. Wonderful sweet nose of black fruits and flowers. If you notice in every one of these wines, we have not seen, one of the flaws in wines is to see vegetal elements in wine. The smell of green beans, asparagus. We have seen not even a trace of it in any wine, to show you what a beautifully ripe vintage this is. I think you see why Pishon Lalande has been so successful. Very supple. I could actually drink this today if I had to. It's very, very round and generous and seductive. We're going to move on and move to, again, another one of the most popular wines probably in the world. A lot of these, wines like Pishon Lalande, I think a lot of the popularity was due to Madame de Loncassang, who traveled throughout the world promoting Pishon Lalande when she was the proprietor. I think we see the same thing with Lynch-Bages. Certainly one of the most popular wines in the world. It has always been extremely popular in Great Britain and the United States, in large part, not just because of the quality, and the quality is impeccably high, but also because of the family behind it, the Caz family. And again, going back to my age, when I first started going to Bordeaux, I was dealing with the father, Jean-Michel Caz, and now I'm dealing with his son, Jean-Charles, who's here. Would you please stand? And for many people, you pick up any textbook on Bordeaux, and this is just considered a classic Pauillac, classic great Pauillac. And it's certainly been in the Caz family for many, many, many decades, and it's a wine that relies primarily on about 3/4 Cabernet Sauvignon and the rest Merlot and Cabernet Franc and a little Petit Verdo. It's a wine that just has, if you were trying for a group of students to define, your prototype, if you were doing a profiling, so to speak, of the classic Pauillac, Lynch-Bages would be it. It's got the cassis, it's got the richness and the power. it's got the exuberance, and it's got the longevity. And so, and of course, its popularity, I think, probably has been sustained for so many years, not only because of the high quality, but because the ownership has been willing to promote and to travel, to obviously support tastings like this, and that has helped with the recognition, name recognition. But it's a big property. It's a very large estate. And this is almost 240 acres, and that's a big size estate. Of course, there's probably less Chateau Lynchbage today than there was 30 years ago, because so much of it now goes into a second wine. Very rich, classic creme de cassis. I think Michael Broadbent used to use the term celestial black currants. You know, there may be some of that right in this wine. But just a beautiful wine of purity, richness, fullness. Again, no hard edges. I think one of the hallmarks of its great vintage is that we're seeing wines that are just perfectly balanced. There's nothing ragged. There's nothing astringent. There's nothing stepping out and that's sharp. We have 2 more Pauillacs to go. As Pancho is looking at me, we okay? No. Okay, all right. We're going to, another very, very popular Pauillac is Pishon Baron. I think we have Christian Seeley here somewhere. Yes, there he is. This is another great example that when I first went to Bordeaux as a professional in 1978, Pishon Baron or Pishon Longueville Baron was good, but nothing special. And then it was acquired by the giant French insurance agency AXA, and immediately the quality soared, and it's been at that high level, if not higher, for really over 20 years now. Again, to me, this is another classic Pauillac, perhaps a little bit more tannic than Lynchbage or Pichon Lalande, but very concentrated, very dark fruits. Certainly a wine for 30, 40 years of cellaring for those who have the patience. Again, it's about 180 acres in size and a blend of roughly a 60% Cabernet Sauvignon and a lot of Merlot and a very little bit of Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdo. Beautiful black. Again, you see this sort of subtle graphite, hint of subtle smoke, a lot of creme de cassis, black, almost blackberry sort of fruit here. There's a lot of tannin in that wine, but it's tannin that is beautifully velvety and integrated. But it's a big wine. It's a large-scaled wine. There's lots of what the English use the word grip, but it's structure. There's a lot of structure. This is certainly built for many, many decades of evolution and consumption. And again, fabulous concentration, texture, purity. Really a stunning wine. The last Pauillac. We have Alfred Tesseron here, who's come to Hong Kong. And Alfred, where are you? Here. Last year when I was flying Air Korea, they had a wonderful video on Pontet Canet. And of course, this is one of the few properties in Bordeaux that is biodynamically farmed, which is you know, some people, you know, the cynics and critics of biodynamic farming would say it's somewhat cultish, and you know, these are extremists and jihadists, you know, in terms of Mother Nature. But I think it's a wonderful thing, and if you can do it and you have the guts and courage to do it, it should be applauded. Pontet Canet, obviously one of the most famous names, as basically everything we've had today are. Right next to Mouton Rothschild. Some people would argue that it's more consistent than Mouton Rothschild and sometimes maybe even better in certain vintages. It's really been a fabulous wine for many years. I think it was always good, but for me personally, I thought they turned a qualitative corner in 1994 and just kept going up from there. And recent vintages, if you've subscribed to my writings, you probably noticed it's gotten some of the highest ratings for all vintages, and it's a stunning wine that is again dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon, but with a lot of Merlot in it as well. Very natural wine, very concentrated wine. Alfred, I think, is making wines to last 50 years, and as I get older, I'm not sure I'll see them in their prime, but magnificent wine, and again, like so many of the wines we're having today, magical, first growth quality, but not at first growth prices. Again, you see I think I see a little bit more of sort of like new saddle leather and earth here than I do in the Pishon Baron or the Pishon Milan or the Lynch-Bage. But again, the cassis, the classic cassis, which is a hallmark of this area. Very rich in the mouth, and we talk about, again, it's a great wine to use to illustrate texture. The texture of this wine is like this. It's like this. It's like this. Magnificent wine. Before we go back to Saint-Emilion to finish the tasting, we have one wine from Saint-Estèphe, and we have the man truly responsible for the great wines that are coming from Chateau Clos d'Estournel here, Jean-Guillaume. Would you mind standing up? Of course, I always like to say when the Baron Rothschild's not in presence that this is the chateau that looks down on Lafite Rothschild. Those of you who've been to Bordeaux know it sits on a high ridge, and Lafite is below it. And so they have a magnificent view overlooking Lafite. It's also one that I think for the Chinese is a pagoda. The architecture is inspired by Asian pagoda. The wine here is basically two grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. Very, very magnificent terroir of gravel, pebbles over limestone. The Jean-Guillaume is his father. His father was the owner of the property at one time and really brought it to the recognition of consumers throughout the world. And I think Jean-Guillaume has done a magnificent job as the manager, and has just increased the quality year in, year out. And I thought the 2009, one of the truly monumental wines of Bordeaux. And see how it's tasting. Really a thrilling wine. A wine of extraordinary concentration, richness, intensity, purity, with decades and decades ahead of it. Really quite magnificent, and bravo. Just stunning stuff. And one of the arguments that in Bordeaux wine circles goes back, who makes among the Saint-Estèphes, which is of course the most northern appellation in Bordeaux. You have other famous properties such as Malraux and Calon-Ségur, La Font-Rocher. But again, Clos d'Estournel is the first one you see as you enter the appellation. And this is a wine of extraordinary concentration and richness. Probably the richest wine we've tasted today in terms of pure intensity. Now you're going to say, what did Parker think by moving back to Saint-Emilion? Well, I thought we'd end on two majestic wines that are very sumptuous and rich, and go back to Saint-Emilion, and two wines that probably are symptomatic of my career. That again, these are two estates that when I first went to Bordeaux as a professional in 1978, neither Clos Forte or Angelus were making very good wine, and yet through the passion of the owners, the commitment to quality. Now they're among the stars, or if not superstars, in all of Bordeaux. And so I thought they'd be great to end this tasting with. The first one is Clos Forte, which is on the pure limestone hillsides of Saint-Emilion. And for those of you who haven't been to Bordeaux, it's everywhere is pretty fascinating. The city itself is fabulous since Mayor Juppé has cleaned it up and put a new rail system in, and just beautiful. And obviously the Médoc, the Grave areas are gorgeous countryside, but probably the number one tourist attraction is the town of the old medieval town of Saint-Emilion. And Clos Forte sits right outside of Saint-Emilion. It's about 45 acres, and it's mostly Merlot. It's about 80% Merlot, and we have, where is she? I know she's here, representative of the Cuvelier family. Again, a great example of a family by the name of Cuvelier who purchased Clos Forte and just did everything right. And the result speaks for itself. This is one of my favorite 2009s, as are all of these actually. So beautifully ripe Merlot. I mean, just a wonderful intensity and richness of fruit. Very unctuous and opulent in the mouth. Stunning concentration. And I think what's going to be interesting, this will be interesting to contrast with the last wine, the Chateau Angelus, which has got a much stronger component of Cabernet Franc in it, nearly 50% or more, and the rest Merlot, and occasionally some Cabernet Sauvignon. But again, a great wine, but a different style. And of course, this is on the lower slopes of Saint-Emilion with some limestone, but less limestone than Clos Forte. I hope you're as pleased with these wines. I mean, terrific wine. I mean, rich. Who's here from Angelus? We've got to acknowledge your presence. Oh, there she is. Okay. And I think you see the influence of the Cabernet Franc in that second wine. I mean, it's a little bit more aromatic. The Clos Forte is more powerful and concentrated, and the Angelus more aromatic and perhaps more intellectual at this point. But I'm of course, you would say, well, you should be happy because I picked the wines, but but I think it's a great vintage. We saw 20 wines that behaved beautifully for as young as they are. You never know what you have, as they say, until you pull the cork. And certainly these wines were consistent. They showed the magic of what I hoped they would do. They demonstrated the brilliance of Bordeaux. They exhibited why we have so much confidence in the great wines of Bordeaux. And that as wine consumers today, we're luckier than ever before because we have so many high quality wines such as these, wines of true first growth quality. If these wines were being tasted in the 1950s, they would probably be better than any first growth made in the 1950s. You could say that in the 1960s. And yet, even today, we could have the best first growths and these would be just as good. Certainly, I want to thank all of you who've been amazingly patient. Logistically, it's not easy to go through 20 wines in a short period of time. And I'm sorry if I rushed at the very end, but I know they have other events and things to do. But
we have 15 minutes for Q&A if you want.
But we do have 15 minutes for question and answers. And so anyone who wants to ask any question, feel free to do so. I just want to tell you, it's been a privilege. I first came to Hong Kong in 1998. I've been coming to Asia every year since 1998, but this is the first time back in Hong Kong. It's an extraordinary city, as everyone knows. It's certainly become increasingly the world capital of wine. It's a great honor for me to be here. It's a great honor for me to see people from Bordeaux who so generously come and to present their wines through me as their surrogate. I think this vintage is one of the greatest vintages in my lifetime. It's been a wonderful privilege to share my comments with you. So if you have questions, go ahead and ask them.
Can you tell me what you think the role is in alcohol? There's a big movement against high alcohol wines, and yet often these wines are very balanced.
We can't hear. I'm sorry.
Oh, God.
Can we have the sound a little bit higher, please? We can't hear.
I know, it looks like I'm a politician now, not hearing your question, but no, we'll get it. We'll get an answer.
I'll stand. My name's Andrew Kayard. I'm from Sydney, Australia. The Chateau Cos de Stornel has got an alcohol level of above 15%, I think, and yet it's got extraordinary beauty and balance. Can you tell me what you feel about these type of wines in the world of modern wine?
Well, I think you probably answered your own question saying it's a wine of beautiful balance and concentration. I think the world changes, and what were the parameters and what we considered classic knowledge 20 or 30 years ago evolves. And I think Cos de Stornel, at 15% alcohol. I mean, there are many wines from Pomerol and Saint-Emilion that are 15% alcohol. It's completely hidden. It's completely concealed. There's not a bit. I find nothing hot or out of balance. I think, this will be a kind of wine like 1947 Cheval Blanc was in its age, when it was a wine. Now, this wine has no defects unless you're an alcohol phobe. But I do think, alcohol can be excessive. There's no question. There's always a question of balance, and it can be pushed too much. This is not one of those cases. This is a majestic wine that I think that its legacy will be talked about as one of the great wines ever made in Bordeaux in 20, 30, 40 years. I am sure of that. I won't be here to read that, but I'm 100% convinced that we just see, sometimes when you taste something that goes beyond the normal parameters, the first reaction is it's hostility, because no one's ever seen anything like that. But I think with those with an open mind that are tasting the wine and not looking at numbers, they're in the presence of something great. And they'll realize that right away. And I'll give you an example real quickly, is that very early in my career, very early, when I just started, I was invited over to a wealthy collector's house who had actually loved the wines of Pomerol. He was actually partially responsible why I discovered Pomerol. He opened a wine for me, 1961 Latour Pomerol, okay, owned by the Muex family. And this is probably about the third year of the Wine Advocate. I don't remember exactly. The wine was so concentrated, so, quote, over the top, so jammy, almost like dry vintage port. I tasted it, I sat it down, and I said, Paul, I'm not sure I like this wine. He said, well, I think this is one of the greatest wines ever made. Fortunately, by the time I went back for a second glass, I was in agreement. And I think what happens is that when you taste something that goes beyond anything you've ever had before, at first you really have a hard time understanding it. But if you're open-minded and you look at it from, is it balanced? What's there? And then you're fine. So that's my answer.
One more question over here.
Hi, it's Hi, just wanted to ask you, comparing today and how you tasted the wines today compared to when you had the barrel tastings back, last year, how much has it changed over the time?
In a tasting like this, when I'm focused on trying to make a presentation, all I can say is that I was more pleased with the way these wines were showing than I thought they would show, given the fact they had been bottled over the last 6 months, obviously transported to Hong Kong. I'm going to Bordeaux in January to obviously taste all the 2009s in bottle multiple times. But I'm thrilled with the way these wines are showing, and I feel validated that this is a truly, truly magnificent vintage. And I think when I first tasted them, if you go back and look what I wrote, the characteristics that I pointed out was that they were relatively high in alcohol, they were very concentrated, that they had very sweet tannins. I think all those characteristics were demonstrated in this tasting today. But what impressed me even more than perhaps the barrel tastings is the elegance of a lot of the wines and the finesse of the tannins. I think the tannins are actually even sweeter and better integrated than I remember them being from barrel. Thank you.